crimes. Over 50% of the people in our prisons today are there for victimless crimes. That means a crime where there's been no damage to any property, there's been no damage to any person, and there's been no interference with anybody else's rights. Those are victimless crimes. The law enforcement growth industry, they're out there arresting people at an ever-increasing rate. They take you to court, and you end up paying a hefty fine. And they take that hefty fine, and they hire more police officers and buy more guns and more riot gear and more tasers and more equipment like that so that they can go out and arrest more people, so that they can collect more fines, so that they can buy more riot gear and more guns and more cop cars and hire more police officers. And then they take you to a place which I hope none of you ever go to. It's called prison. And in this country, Eisenhower learned this in the 1950s about the military-industrial complex. But let me tell you something. There's something out there that's more onus than that. It's called the prison industrial complex. And it kind of works like the motel industry. The more beds that are filled, the more money that they want it to be made. And the more money is made on the New York Stock Exchange. The more those shares of stock go up by private corporations like Wackenhut and the Corrections Corporation of America. So let me encourage you, if none of you have read the Bill of Rights or the Constitution of the United States, let me encourage you to do so, because that's where we learn what our rights are. And in this country, if you don't know what your rights are, then you don't have any. Let me tell you about I give seminars. I teach people how to defend themselves in court, and I've been very successful at it. I've won 93 out of 107 criminal cases and 55 out of 59 civil cases, including a $500,000 bankruptcy in federal court. I've done OSHA hearings, and I teach people what their rights are. And one of the first things I tell people is there's only 3 things you want to keep uppermost in your mind when you're being hassled by the man and when you're being charged in court with a misdemeanor crime. And those 3 things are, listen to me closely, when you're hassled by the man, when you're stopped on the street, 3 things that you have to remember. Number 1 is shut up. Keep your mouth shut. 70 to 85% of all convictions in this country are gotten through admissions and confessions. If you keep your mouth shut, you're way ahead of the game. And the cops are trained in the schools how to get you to talk. The second thing is, don't talk. And the third thing is, if you want to win your case in court defending yourself, the third thing is, shut up. Keep your mouth shut. Don't give them any information. Unless you're driving a car, you don't even have to tell them your name. The first time I was arrested in Latah County, I was charged with obstructing and delaying an officer. And it kind of went down like this. The 3 officers approached me and they asked me what my name was. I've got a habit. I answer a question with the question. I ask them, why do you want to know? And they said, well, you got to tell us. I said, no, I don't. And they said, well, Idaho statute says you do. And I said, well, according to Miranda versus Arizona, Michigan versus DeFilippo, and Brown versus Texas, I'm not obligated to identify myself in and during an in-custody interrogation. Now, am I under arrest or am I free to go? One of the officers was so ignorant of the law, and I've come to find out that most officers are, he told me, well, son, you're not in Arizona. So Miranda versus Arizona doesn't apply in Idaho. Well, I've got news for you. Miranda versus Arizona is a Supreme Court decision, applies to all the states in the United States. So they arrested me anyway and took me to jail, and I was charged with obstructing and delaying an officer. Now, the officer clearly told me that I was being arrested for not identifying myself in court. Well, they took me to jail, and they couldn't fingerprint me, photograph me, and I refused to wear their jail clothes, and I gave them a Supreme Court decision for each one of those cases why I didn't have to oblige them and do what they were telling me to do. I'll tell you, I was the first one, probably the only one in this county that ever came out of jail still dressed in my civilian clothes. And then I took complete control of that courtroom for over an hour. At one point, the judge, who's just recently retired, he said, "Mr. Thurston, I need to know how much longer you're going to take, because there's a lot of people here waiting for their cases to be heard, and I need to know whether I can tell them whether their cases are going to be heard with some expediency or not." I looked at the judge and I said, "Sir, if I'm bothering you, you're free to go." And I had already told him that I wasn't there voluntarily, that I was there under threat, duress, and coercion. And anything that you say or sign under threat, duress, and coercion isn't good in any court of law. So, what do you need to do when you're hassled by the man? You keep your mouth shut. Chief Justice Warren Bergen, let me talk a little bit about the lawyers in this country. In this country, we have a monopoly. It's called the American Bar Association. They've got a monopoly on who can practice law in these courts. All attorneys are lawyers, but not all lawyers are attorneys. Most attorneys don't even know that distinction. But an attorney, the word comes from the Latin or the Greek, and it means to transfer rights. And that's what attorneys are in court doing. They're either transferring your rights to somebody else, giving your property to somebody else, or they're transferring your rights to the state, as is the case in a victimless crime where you're caught with a little bit of hemp in your pipe or something like that. They drag you off to court and they charge you with a misdemeanor, and they get you feeling real guilty, like you did something wrong. Well, I don't know about you, but I've never felt that it was wrong to put anything in my body that I wanted to. If I'm hurting anybody, I'm hurting myself. The purpose of government is to secure rights among men. That is the foremost purpose of government. That's why we have courts. That's why we have judges. That's why we have a legislative department. And that's why we have an executive department. And their purpose is to secure your rights. But that's not what they're out there doing. Most of the time they're out there robbing you of your rights. Let me repeat. If you don't know what your rights are, then you don't have any. And if you're not in court demanding your rights, then you're waiving your rights. So you want to be in court, and you want to be demanding your rights.
Are you done?
It's called being the belligerent claimant in person. The Supreme Court even gave it its own terminology. When you're in court demanding your rights, you're what the Supreme Court defines as the belligerent claimant in person. In other words, I'm demanding all my rights under the federal Constitution, under the Constitution of the state of Idaho, and under the statutes of this state. Now, when you're arrested for a crime, they usually say, well, you're charged with possession, or you're charged with having paraphernalia, or you're charged with being under the influence. That isn't the charge, folks. If you want to really find out what you're being charged with, then look at your